Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Ingram. I am the lab lead for the GMLC project that is sponsoring this workshop. Before we get started, a little housekeeping items. If you've noticed in the announcement or warning at the top, my colleague Katie McMahon has started the recording. If you're a veteran of this process, you know we've had two prior workshops on other topics. Those were not recorded, but at the request of many who have attended, we're recording this one, and we will post the video, the recording, and transcript and all that good stuff at a later time. Uh, these are the rules that we have to notify you of, make you aware of, and have everyone's consent and by attendance, we have your consent. That's how we view that. Okay. So as I said, this is our third workshop. The prior two, there'll be a link at the end, can take you to our website where we have a number of resources about interconnection and IEEE 1547 posted. And there's workshop material there from the prior workshops. And we will post the presentations and like I said, the video when we get that compiled. So here's the agenda. Jeff Cook, also with NREL, will be talking about strategies reducing timelines. Nadav and Tom Key from EPRI will be talking about technical screens, how to improve those. Shay Banton with IREC will be talking about prospecting tools, helping developers and others to identify the best locations, the best economics, and all those sorts of things. And then I'll wrap up at the end, talk a little bit about new opportunities and the exciting interconnection innovation exchange, which is what I2X stands for. And like I said, an opportunity there. The workshop goals are to increase awareness of the existing materials and to help state utility commissions with the interconnection processes, adopting 1547 and all those sorts of things. Hopefully it's an opportunity to connect, to help you to connect with each other. And like I said, there'll be a little opportunity at the end to extend that. And we're going to ask a few questions here and there, and so it'll be an opportunity for DOE and the labs that support the Department of Energy to learn a little bit about where you are and what your needs are. So I mentioned that this is funded by the Grid Modernization Lab Consortium, the GMLC, which is a program within the Department of Energy that's funded by multiple departments. And that program, the GMLC, technical assistance to state utility commissions, has these tracks. And within the utility regulation, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, we have a number of these that some of you may be involved with other labs. There's several labs involved in addition to NREL. But this program or project, if you will, of course, fits into ER adoption and integration. A little bit about NREL. We have about approximately 3,000 folks. This picture is our beautiful campus in Golden, Colorado, nested up against the foothills of the Rockies. South Table Mountain there on the left. Oh no, sorry, right behind the building. And you know, if you're in the neighborhood, if you have the opportunity, I encourage you to give us a visit. A little bit about what we do, of course, and many folks are familiar with NREL. Renewable power, of course, sustainable transportation, electric vehicles, hydrogen, of course, as well, energy efficiency, and energy systems integration. With that, I'm going to turn the screen and the mic, if you will, over to Jeff, and he's going to talk about strategies for reducing timelines. So I'm going to stop sharing and drop camera.
Thanks,
Ready?
Michael. I
Thank
will
you.
jump on camera here for a moment for people to put face to name, but then I'll be looking sideways, so I'll go off camera after that. so that during the presentation part. So nice to meet everybody. I'm Jeff Cook. I've been here at the lab for about 10 years, and I've worked in distributed solar pretty much the entire time I've been here. Worked in community solar for about 5 years, but still very much in that distributed space. And that's a lot about what we're going to be talking about today, looking at a lot of NREL's work, looking at this idea of what do existing interconnection timelines look like today, and then what could they look like in the future, and what sort of factors influence what those timelines are. So we have a lot to get through today, but I think we'll have plenty of time for questions also. So if you have questions at any point in time, don't hesitate to put them into the chat, and so that we will be able to either address them in real time if I see them there, or we'll be able to address them at the end. All right, so let's jump right in. So this is an older version of that slide that Michael put up there. So we've grown a ton since the past 5 years or so, and we've also grown our partnerships from 750 here to over 900, and we're increasing those every time. And we're really excited about this effort as a part of one of those partnerships. And in my view, those partnerships are critical to us to having a successful impact on the market, because they prove that everything we're doing actually is valued by stakeholders and folks from the marketplace, ensuring that all of our research gets to the people who need it, which is in part what this webinar workshop is all about today, helping us get technical assistance and information from the lab to stakeholders. So really excited, as I said, to talk about this or to have this conversation today. NREL's research relative to permitting, interconnection, and inspection, we consider that whole kind of process of review and approvals holistically. And we do that because we think it's important to evaluate all three of those different things individually, but also understanding how they build off of each other or interact with each other. So yes, today we're going to talk about interconnection, but NREL has looked at the whole review and approval process in overall, not just at the utility, not just at a local government building department, and not just at an environmental review level at the state or local level. So we do analysis in what you'll hear me refer to as PII, which again is permitting, inspection, and interconnection, to really look at all of the process requirements. What does it take to get an interconnection agreement? What are those individual factors? What are the process by which you go through those steps? How long do each of those steps take? How long does the whole adoption cycle take, or implementation or installation process take, to get from contract approved or customer willing to install a system all the way to permission to operate? So we look at that whole process. We look at all of those factors and what might influence cancellations, timelines, or otherwise explain potential delays or best practices in use in one place versus another place. And then we also are working to try and increase transparency. There's 20,000 local governments nationwide, and there's over 3,000 utilities, and each one has its own unique requirements. So that's a lot of knowledge that's needed for installers or developers to understand how to get through the process efficiently, which can result in a lot of errors in applications or delays because they don't know the process of a given utility. And so part of what NREL's goal is to try to alleviate some of those information asymmetries, to again reduce timelines where possible, to ensure safe, efficient installations. So we do a lot of analysis and research on the left-hand side, but we've also developed software to help streamline and automate the process of either permitting, and that we've done through our Solar Automated Permit Processing Plus platform, or Solar App Plus. And then we've done something similar in automating DR technical screens in our Precise product, which only automates one component, or potentially automates one component of the interconnection review process, but yet is a critical step towards implementing a streamlined process over for interconnection, whereby in both of those softwares, we're ensuring a safe system can be connected to the grid in the context of Precise when looking at the technical screens, or a safe solar system can be installed per the building code relative to the Solar App Plus platform. So we both do research to develop best practices, do technical assistance, deliver data, but then we also use all of that to develop software products. And we'll talk a little bit about the precise product today, because it is one pathway by which you could improve timelines for interconnection, depending on how that process is currently set up. And I saw, thanks, Katie, for responding to the question in the chat already. So please do put your questions in the chat so that we can try and answer them as you have them, or of course, get that dialogue going as just happened. So thank you, Robert and Katie, for both jumping on the chat bandwagon. I encourage everybody else to chime in there too, to make this as useful for you as possible. So let's set some context. First, we know that contractors in the distributed space have told us that AHJ building code or building permit application processes and interconnection approval to build where those exist and permission to operate processes are major contributors to project delay. Now, this is a contractor survey for just contractors. We didn't do the same thing and survey utilities about what they think causes delays in projects. And so you might get something different from them. But ultimately, this is what we got from contractors. In addition, as many of you have heard, there's a lot of news stories out there about interconnection queue delays nationwide. So that's starting to get into the popular press as well. So it's not just contractors keying in on this, but also we're getting the popular press and the trade press commenting on how long interconnection queues are. Predominantly for those large utility scale systems is what you're seeing in the popular press. But this is also a problem at the distributed level for both the jurisdictional permitting process and the interconnection review process as well. So that's what the contractors are reflecting in this survey we asked. So first, contractors told us it takes a long time to do this. So since we understood that, and we knew contractors also have a vested interest in tracking the time and the status of any given project, we then went to over 13 national installers of solar projects, and we asked them to give us data to show us the timestamps of when the customer was approved, when they submitted their permits, when they submitted their interconnection agreements, when they completed an install, conducted an inspection, and then ultimately got permission to operate. And so we initially got 200,000 rooftop PV systems. We're now well over 580,000 projects. So a relatively big data file. And you can see it covers a lot of the large solar markets across the country, but of course not all of them. It also covered initially 1,500 jurisdictions. We're now much more over that. I think it might even be 3,000. And on the utility side, we're well over 200 plus utilities included in the data set. Now, if you're aware of any public data or any contractor data or any data you might have showing any of the timestamps we just referenced, we'd encourage you to reach out to us and provide that information to us or give us some leads to get more data in the tool. In addition, we'll be, of course, continuing to add systems and utilities and jurisdictions to the tool in 2023 and beyond. So SolarTrace is not a one-time thing. It is meant to be a full product or a long-term product for use nationwide. So here on this slide, you're seeing a little bit, just 1 year of data, and this is 2020, showing where all of the installs were. So this is just a different version of that map I was just showing with some of the data from a specific year. In that specific year, we had about a quarter of all US installs reflected. And then we had 50% of the installs covered for the states in which we had data. So where we had data for states, we feel really good about it. And overall, we feel pretty good about how we're looking at a whole national scale in terms of all of the data we have. And these numbers are pretty consistent as you move forward into the 21-22 data that we've also been collecting. So quite a lot of data, but again, not in every state. So our data is not illustrative of what you might find in Oklahoma, but it would be pretty illustrative of what you might find in California or Texas, Illinois, et cetera. So again, pretty robust program and a data tool. All right, So what do timelines look like in the distributed residential rooftop space, which is predominantly what Solar Trace to this point can investigate? So in the context of that, Solar Trace has tracked that it can take about between 90 to 120 business days to get a residential rooftop solar project contract signed and installed with permission to operate. So it's actually operating out in the field. Um, you can see importantly why I laid out before why we investigate PII holistically, because if you just looked at interconnection, which is the bottom part of the graph, and let's say we just found a really good way to streamline interconnection and we made that process, we made it 0 days or same day. It's still happening concurrently often with the permit process. So you haven't actually dramatically improved your timeline because those two processes typically happen at the same time. Now you'll probably have some savings, but you wouldn't have a one for one. So if your timeline took 10 days, now it's 0 days, you're not always going to get a 10-day savings because you have to deal with the permit, right? But if you can streamline both of those to efficiently and safely deliver permits and approval to build agreements or interconnection agreements, then you could have a mutual benefit, or you could actually see that 10-day savings. This could then help contractors to better schedule their jobs so installations happen faster. And then you got to deal with inspection and PTO, right? So then you got to deal with those parts of the process. So it's important to think about interconnection separately, like approval to build and PTO, especially when they're different. And the same also when thinking about when you incorporate or layer on the building department ramifications as well. So that's why it's important to think about the whole timeline and all aspects that might interact in that timeline, as opposed to just singling out one without understanding the ramifications for others. So you've heard me reference Solar Trace a couple times. Katie, if you wouldn't mind putting a link in the chat where people can access Solar Trace directly, that would be great. But ultimately, the tool will allow a contractor or any user to enter a couple of places into the tool, or many places into the tool, and see the current timelines and current requirements for different installation or different permitting requirements or interconnection requirements. And I apologize, I should have put the interconnection requirements on this slide, but we have those as well. Things like whether there's a hosting capacity map, whether you can pay online, there's an online process, and a variety of others are all located at that link that Katie just put in the chat for you. So it can show how utilities compare if there's a pre-install interconnection process, like an approval to build process, or just a post-install interconnection process, and you can see how they compare here. And you would see that on the map as well. Or sorry, you would see them on the map, but you'd see it in this figure as well. So you can compare timelines across each other, and that can help jurisdictions or utilities see how they're comparing to their peers in terms of their review processes, which is data that a lot of folks didn't have or don't have in all states. So it's a really cool tool. We encourage you to take a look. All right. So I've said my piece about how you should look at the entire process, but now let's drill into interconnection processes and timelines. What do they look like today? So utilities in some states have streamlined their approval to build, meaning there is no approval to build process. It's about as streamlined as one can get. Those states or utilities in those states have decided that a pre-install process is not necessary. Places like California, where about half of the market currently is. In addition, that does not mean that the California or others don't also have a post-install or permission to operate review process. Now, in the state of California, you can see it's 0 on the left, which is your approval to build review timeline. And then you have post-install. It takes 3 days for them to do that review process. That is incredibly quick, especially when you think about how long it can take governmental agencies to review things. So that's very quick. Now, if you compare Nevada, Nevada's doesn't have that same approval to build process, but they take 16 days to do their permission to operate reviews. And so it shows you that even when you don't have an ATB process, it can be quick or it can be long. Now, in places that have a pre-install process and a post-install process, places in Arizona and Georgia and Hawaii, you can see they have a long review process at both steps of the puzzle. And the question then becomes, well, why is that true? One could argue if you have no approval to build process, then it could make sense you have a longer permission to operate process. But it's not totally clear why you'd have a long one at the start and a long one at the other end. So that's an open question that we don't really know the answer to, but that's what the data is showing and is an area ripe for additional research. Now, what do interconnection timelines look like from first application submission to PTO? So here you can see what that looks like. So in the context of California, it's very short because there's that PTO process right at the end. And if it just takes 3 days, you can get that application submitted in PTO really quickly. Other places, you got that approval to build to permission to operate process. So you're submitting this, a lot of those processes look a lot like the entire adoption timeline. So that's where you see places like Georgia, Hawaii, New Mexico, Nevada, taking a pretty long time to get from a contractor or a homeowner wants to do solar. It could take over almost a half a year to get solar, depending on where you are and what utility service territory you're working in. So significant variability nationwide, even in places with high penetrations of solar and places in relatively lower penetrations of solar. It's sort of all over the map. So then the question then becomes from there, what causes that, or what opportunities may there be to streamline the process? Now, before we get to that, let's just summarize some of the key findings that we've just talked about. So on average, it can take from 4 to 4.5 months to get from contract signing to permission to operate. But that's at the average time. And so when you're thinking about the 95 percentile, projects that are in that bottom 5% could be completed, or sorry, the top 5%, excuse me, bottom 5% in terms of the how long it takes, right? So they take the longest, could be 9 months, 9 months or less. So typically 9 months is that kind of longer timeline. But then if you're thinking about it when you're in the best, sort of that 5th percentile in terms of the top 5%, then it could be anywhere from as little as 1 week to 6 weeks to get your solar. So that's just a huge variation across the country, whereby you could get solar on your home as a homeowner in 6 weeks, or you could get it in 9 months. And this has real ramifications on the homeowner and the contractor. So if the contractor doesn't know if it's going to be 6 weeks or 9 months, they have a lot of difficulty scheduling their installations, as I mentioned before, which is why they have to scale them or stretch them out so far to make sure they don't have crews that are idle at any given time. Or if the project could be installed in 6 weeks, then homeowner could be getting a lot more benefit from their solar project a lot sooner, and there could be benefits to the grid a lot sooner than if it has to wait 9 months. Because contractors know about this variability and they don't exactly know what will happen, they've also told us that they charge more in places where PII processes, either permitting or interconnection processes, are difficult. They charge more to homeowners because either A, they don't want to work with that utility or permitting entity, so they just charge more, and homeowners still want solar, so they accept the contract. Or B, they bake that in so that they have some buffer for any sort of additional conversations they need to have with the utility or the jurisdiction, any expected more likely callbacks or permit revision changes because plan reviewer A reviewed it one way and plan reviewer B then reviewed it another way, and the contractor had to make 2 separate changes, and then when it went to inspection they had to make another change because now the inspector interpreted the code differently. And same thing could be if you have an interconnection utility inspection out there as well. So a lot of opportunities for callbacks depending on how those are enforced. In any event, all of that is problematic for the solar industry writ large, or for homeowners interested in installing. And we are going to talk about some improvements that could be possible. You already heard me talk a little bit about the idea of having approval to build processes, which could then result in faster interconnections overall. But that's not always true, as we saw as well on the previous slide, that sometimes you can have a faster approval to build, but yet a longer permission to operate, or you have long steps at both of those parts of the puzzle, and so it becomes more confusing. I always like to have this call to action slide in here, as I mentioned before. The data that we're describing to you now and any sort of work we do going forward is dependent on having up-to-date information from either contractors or from utilities or from PUCs that collect interconnection queue data. So if you are aware of any data relative to timestamps, as I mentioned before, for solar projects, for solar and storage projects, for community scale projects, for any type of project, please do let us know or reach out to us via email. Katie, if you wouldn't mind putting my email in the chat, would love to hear, and yours so that we have accountability, but would love to hear from you on how you might be able to help us to continue this critical research. Or if you have thoughts yourself about why, well, I know exactly why our ATB process is long and our post-install process is long, throw that in the chat or email us directly, and we'd love to hear that information too. Okay, so how have timelines evolved? So we know utility interconnections of solar, and every sort of new project or equipment, there's a learning curve. People aren't familiar, it takes longer to review, but then you sort of streamline and get your process down, and you can do the 100th application much quicker than you can do the first one. However, if you have a bunch more volume, even if you're processing every permit or interconnection agreement faster, that doesn't mean that you're ultimately permitting or moving them out of your queue any faster because the volume is just so much higher. So what does that look like? We were able to look at 5 states to think about, well, have interconnection review timelines improved or have they slowed down? And in the 5 states that we had data into the study back in 2013, 2015, we were able to track the pre-install approval to build timelines. And you can see those in Arizona, California, Colorado, New Jersey, and New York. We were able to do this for really small projects and then for larger projects. Across all 5 states, we saw a significant, dramatic improvement in the review timeline. So utilities gotten a lot better at reviewing, even though interconnection applications have gone way up. And California is a really great example. It used to take a long time for pre-install reviews, and now they don't require that anymore. So you see the most dramatic reduction in that timeline for those smaller projects. So you see a really big improvement there. You also see big improvements elsewhere where there's been a lot of learning and improvement on how to reduce timelines. So, or how to make their review processes more efficient. So that's actually, really interesting and something we weren't sure what we were going to see. But that's sort of a 10-year, now it's a 10-year difference. But the question becomes, well, if we add storage, do we then see review timelines that look more like they did in 2013? Or do they stay closer to what they are now? And so as new technologies come in, are there pathways by which we can ensure the learning curve doesn't take as long as it might have done for solar? Fundamentally open question there. So we know that timelines have improved, but how do they compare to state mandated review timelines? So a lot of states require utilities to review projects in a certain time frame, and that's in statute. And oftentimes there's not a lot of enforcement mechanisms for that, but in some places there are. In the context of Excel, for example, they have a community solar queue timeline and they got dinged pretty hard for not hitting their queue review timelines. So it can be enforced with penalties, but in most cases they are not and do not have that type of enforcement mechanism. Even so, of course, no one wants to be breaking the law. So when you look at that, the red lines are the state requirement for a pre-install application review process. And so you can see most of the time, most utilities for most projects are approving them within the state mandated timelines. However, in places like Virginia, Hawaii, a significant portion of projects are approved after the state mandated review timeline. And some places as well, like Arizona, New Jersey, you're still seeing, at least 5% or 20% of projects that are being approved outside of the state mandates. So overall, utilities are doing pretty well, but in some places they aren't. But also an interesting thing here is it doesn't really matter what the mandated timeline is. for how stringent the review can be. It doesn't really affect what utilities are doing. Perhaps that's because of the enforcement mechanisms not existing. Perhaps it's because there's a variety of utility best practices that they're all using, and they're all then benefiting from that. But ultimately, we're not seeing that states with more stringent timelines are seeing, more faster review timelines than places with longer ones, or even places that don't have them at all. Ultimately, though, again, variation here, as you can see, which reflects sort of what our data showed on our previous slide. Not going to spend too much time here other than to say it's very similar in these larger projects, though in some places like California, they are exceeding those timelines a lot more, in Colorado too, depending on the project and how many are in the state. So similar story here as what we just said on the smaller side, but still thought it'd be worth sharing this so you can find your state should you be in one of the ones that we've been tracking. All right, so revisiting this, we do know and suspect that pre-install application timelines have gone down over time, and we suspect interconnection review timelines for solar have improved on balance nationwide. Now, that doesn't mean that individual utilities have all gotten better or all benefited. In fact, they have not, because they don't all have the same opportunities. So we'll talk about that in a second. But most of the time, 95% of projects meet their requirements, but in some places they don't. And so that becomes an enforcement question, like we mentioned earlier. And then finally, we have seen those timelines decline over time. It's just not necessarily correlated with whatever state required mandate exists. So now, what can we do to streamline or better improve these processes? Because I don't always like using the term streamline. I think what we're trying to consider here is how do we make these processes more efficient while they're still carrying out their critical core requirement to ensure systems are safely installed or interconnected to the grid. Like, how can we efficiently do that? That's the question at hand, or the question that we are trying to ask or answer, or just both ask and answer. So first, we did a variety of interviews with utilities in particular, and we said, hey, what are the biggest barriers to these timelines or getting these timelines reduced? And oftentimes it was incomplete or inaccurate application. So contractor submits the wrong information. You got to go back and forth several times. Could we set up a process whereby it's online and you would no longer get an incomplete application? It may be incorrect, but you would no longer get an incomplete one. That's a good step one. You can eliminate some steps in the process if you could just ensure the application is complete. Now, are there ways you could avoid incorrect applications? So in the solar app, for example, it will tell the contractor immediately what they might have gotten wrong or their system is not code compliant. And it could tell them right away, you might want to check X, Y, or Z before a human even looked at it. Could be really interesting if we could incorporate some model like that for interconnection so that those applications can at least be accurate at the start. And that could all be done through standardizing an online application and or a payment portal. So some might be able to allow a submission of an application online, but you still have to mail a check. You have to mail a check. And we all know when's the last time I mailed a check, which was probably 5 years ago. So certainly some utilities, if they could process payments online, could eliminate a few days of time there. A lot of utilities do that. And so that's beneficial already. To allow that sort of online payment. But if that can be in one portal, that can be helpful to ensure that everything gets done. Also providing training to contractors and utilities on how to work through or successfully navigate through an interconnection application process would be really valuable. Everybody mentioned that, and then that could help reduce the opportunities for incomplete or inaccurate applications, thereby streamlining the process and removing some of the potential built-in delays associated with that. There's also an unclear communication pathway, and that's internally and should be between utility staff in terms of who needs to do the review, when and how, and when does that information need to be conveyed back to the installer. So if you have a huge queue, it can be difficult and some projects can get lost or people have turnover and then you have to educate who does what. Some utilities have designated a solar staff person for which contractors can go to as a go-to person to tell them anything about a solar job they might have submitted. So all of that can be really valuable on the utility side. And then external communication between utility and installer to help the two work better together, to ensure that products move as efficiently as possible were some of the other feedback that we received from utilities. And this ultimately, if you can streamline that, could then help ensure that contractors know what to implement or install. They can check on a project to make sure it hasn't gotten lost, and all of those benefits that you already can see from just tracking yourself in utility scale queues, for example. And even in that case, there's probably some opportunities for changes and benefits there. You've already heard me talk about this before, is could we automate or adjust review processes to incorporate some automation so humans don't have to do all of the work? And that's the model of Solar App Plus and Precise. And we're going to talk about Precise here in a second. And another opportunity, of course, that's clear is waiving the approval to build process entirely, as done in California. However, some utilities, of course, were very concerned with this and thought that the approval to build was critical to their review process. And so it's just opens that question of why in California is it not required or not deemed essential, whereas in other states and utilities it is deemed essential. And it's not entirely clear why you can have those different perspectives on it. So an open question there, but it's just true to say that it's a controversial choice for sure, but yet it is working successfully in some places. So I've alluded to Precise a bunch of times. I'm really excited to tell you about it. So NREL developed Precise to automate DR technical screens, and we've implemented it with the Sacramento Municipal Utility District. And we did that in 2022. And so basically, it takes all of the information that a individual would have had to perform, and that could have taken several days or at least hours spread over a couple of days, and it delivers that review instantly, which is really, really exciting. And so it takes all of that information relative to the inverter functions, and then it reports out some results. So since it's been deployed in February of 2022, it automatically evaluates all the incoming rooftop solar PV applications without a human having to do anything. 1,700 applications were processed in the first 6 months, and then it was processed on an average of 13 applications a day. And then it enabled the interconnection of over 10 megawatts of rooftop solar, avoiding thousands of man hours to do all of that. Still modeling over 800 feeders and thousands of secondaries, looking at the entire service area. And it was able to accept about 71 applications without any modification. And then it kicked up a few, the other 30% for additional recommended changes for the utility to consider. And this was all in minutes rather than days to weeks. So this was super exciting and really, really great results, similar to what we're seeing with Solar App too. So it'll be interesting to follow these projects and see if they're installed faster, because we were able to do the streamlining of the technical reviews. And again, making it more efficient, whereby the system will follow the algorithm 100% of the time and do it accurately 100% of the time. Of course, you had to test to ensure it was doing that correctly from the start, but then they can do this for all these applications, taking the human eyes out of it, the potential for human error as well, and then allowing those humans to focus on the more difficult projects in their queue, of which there are many, for example, at least 30% of those projects. And so that's a really exciting tool. Now, I'd also be remiss if we didn't talk about this great work that you already are aware of, as well as that NREL does a ton of work relative to technical assistance. And of course, Michael leads a lot of our work and you're all a part of it as well. But I'd always like to give kudos in my presentations to the great technical assistance opportunities, including this one we're talking about here. And many of you also know about all the work we've done around IEEE 1547. So all of our great resources on that standard, which by the way, are another great way to help increase transparency into interconnection requirements if IEEE 1547 was widely adopted and implemented across all the states, that can offer standardization for contractors trying to install their equipment or construct their equipment relative to meeting those standards. So really great resources on that site as well. Um, and of course, guides for how folks can implement those requirements. So I wanted to make sure you all got that, a little bit of that knowledge too. Repetition, in my view, is always important.
All right. I'm not on camera, not because I'm shy, but because I am having glitches with internet connectivity, and it's messing with my juju. So I will hopefully my the timbre of my voice will be recognizable to you. Nadav Enbar, I'm a program manager at EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute, joined by my colleague Tom Key. And EPRI, for those of you who don't know, does a lot of work around the interconnection process, both in terms of administrative issues, some of which were touched on just now by Jeff, as well as the technical issues. And we want to talk a little bit about today some of the opportunities for improving the technical screens that are being applied to be able to review interconnection applications to distribution in this particular case. So we'd like to start today's conversation by providing a bit of a background and history behind the emergence of screens and the milestones that have established them in their current form. We'll then talk through how industry developments are providing a level of motivation really to modify review screens. And in particular, we're going to focus in on a couple of issues. The first is around IEEE standard 1547/2018. That's the standard that governs the interconnection of DER in North America. And it basically mandates that DERs provide support to the grid. And that's really a big change from how DERs were sort of previously treated. The other issue we want to talk about as far as motivations for change are newer technologies, the emergence of things like energy storage, battery storage, which introduces new challenges thanks to the technology's flexible operation. And then from there, we'll really talk through some suggested improvements to technical review that include modifications to screens and some other things, which we'll talk briefly about. We do really encourage you guys to pose questions as we go through. Please don't necessarily feel like you need to wait to the end. We'll be looking at chat, although Tom, I can't see it, so please do let me know if things come up. And do
I am
check.
watching the chat. Yeah, please go ahead and ask any questions as we go.
Excellent. All right, so let's jump in here. To get us started here, there's a real need to reform and evolve the DER interconnection review process, and that's in large part due to a couple of key issues. The first is really increasing volumes of interconnections, just really the sheer numbers, their volume. And with these interconnections, that's really leading to rising grid penetration levels of DER on distribution feeders. And with that rising penetration, utilities are really performing more detailed and time-consuming and costly, really, to the applicant, full studies to ensure grid reliability and safeties. These full studies really require a lot more data, modeling, and really an extended effort to complete them. The second major issue here is the greater diversity of DER technologies like battery storage, as I just mentioned, and its operational flexibility. That's really introducing new issues for study that traditional technical review methods really today, they're not equipped to adequately assess in terms of grid impact. So for example, when we think of storage assets and their ability to operate to a schedule, right, and to be export or import limited, for example, when the grid is constrained, that is not typically accounted for in today's review measures, right? They under-recognize the operational potential of batteries while planning to things like worst case scenarios that may not necessarily be valid, right? And then when we think about newer standards like 1547/2018, that adds additional complexity, right, in terms of evaluation and upholding requirements as kind of stipulated in the standard that requires DERs to provide grid support. So these are new considerations that need to be baked in to technical review and screens. And amidst this backdrop, you've got these real questions really facing the industry, some of which we're going to talk through today. How can initial and supplemental reviews, these are the screens that we're going to talk about, how can they be improved given all these emerging issues? What data and modeling approaches can be incorporated really to enhance the accuracy and the efficiency of review, right, to inform grid planning and operations? And what about automation? Jeff alluded to that a bit in some of his talk. How can automation be integrated into the review process to really help speed reviews and help the industry keep up with rising application volumes? So I think it's important for us to kind of have a bit of an overview. Some of this might be remedial of DER technical review practices and processes, so that we can have a context really in the way things have evolved and how we may consider progressing them forward in the future. Really making the grid available for DER interconnections essentially began with PURPA, right? The Public Utility Regulatory Policies Act back in 1978. And since then, interconnection practices have really evolved roughly alongside the informal DER development timeframes that you can see here in this table, spanning almost 50 years. It's over this 50-year period, incremental advances have really occurred in technical review, including several milestones that we're going to get into a little bit more detail on, like technical screens that were originally established in California's Electric Rule 21 back in 1999, interconnection standards and requirements that were established in IEEE Standard 1547 and several iterations. And then this notion of a fast track process created in FERC's Small Generator Interconnection Procedures, the SGIP, in 2005, which has had quite an impact. So I just want to characterize briefly, how things have again progressed forward. And so when we think about the early days, back in the 70s and 80s, we're thinking about mostly interconnection projects, DER interconnection projects that were really pilots, right? Or they were large commercial and industrial systems using things like waste fuels and with special arrangements for how they could get connected. And so back then, really, applications were really manually reviewed, right? Larger connections required comprehensive studies, and that's the way it was done. But as we're going now through later decades in the 80s and the 90s, technical requirements, they basically begin to evolve from these early connections to those used today. And that's really coinciding with the rise of renewables, solar, for example, and a shift from synchronous generators to many more inverter connections that needed to be recognized in review protocols and standards. So as we'll discuss further in a moment, in 99, 2000, entering this millennium, California regulators added a defined set of technical screens to the state's Rule 21 tariff, and that really added definition and the beginnings of a streamlined process for review. And then over the ensuing years, stakeholders really developed and published new standards. I mentioned 1547, 2003, and its successor rules, 2014 and 2018, and that further defined technical requirements for certifying DERs up to, I think it's 10 megawatts onto distribution. So these rules really first restricted DERs from actively providing grid services like voltage regulation, and then they kind of mandated that DER provide grid support, as I mentioned, right? And that really kind of, again, coincided with PV deployments, with how they mushroomed in this hockey stick-like growth, and with the emergence of things like smart inverters that have the capability to help manage the grid, right? So the latest version of this standard was codified in 2018, and that actually defines specific DER performance and grid support capabilities. These are all now being incrementally incorporated into screens or have been identified for particular things that remain to be incorporated into review. I think more recently, a last point I want to make here is the introduction of hosting capacity analysis into interconnection review processes, which offers additional information that we'll talk about, and accuracy and potentially speed to help vet interconnection applications. So a bit of a overview there, and I hope that that context is helpful as we get into the music of where we see improvement opportunities going forward for technical review. I've mentioned a few key milestones that have had a major impact on the look and feel of the interconnection review process. So let's revisit a couple of these. The California's Rule 21 is the first, and again, established in '99 and since continuously updated. Or I should say, one of the major innovations of Rule 21 is that the tariff really defined a set of technical screens. And these screens are today still being used to evaluate whether a particular project could have system impacts that would require a more comprehensive study and potentially distribution system upgrades to mitigate any identified grid impacts from a proposed interconnection. The screens also kind of define pass-fail criteria, right, to determine if more in-depth review is needed. And that's really helpful for taking some of the engineering judgment out of the equation and replacing it with standard evaluation metrics. The other big contribution I want to highlight here to review is the SGIP. Again, introduced in 2005, and that really established a technical review process that, among other things, includes the idea of quote unquote fast track review, which we'll talk about more in just a minute. And that's really intended for systems that don't require a full-blown study, right? So this fast track review, it includes 13 screens, which can determine when and what detailed studies might be required if a project fails a screen. And it also has certain stipulations around what type of projects can qualify. Typically, it's been based on a project's relative size to the voltage level at the point of common coupling. It's important to also recognize that the SGIP process and its screens were really adapted from the transmission point of view and were applied to distribution. And even today, you can see how some things might be improved given that initial perspective. But I think the takeaway point here is that both Rule 21 and the SGIP have, over the years, they've added new things, new requirements, for example, for grid support, thresholds that can for applying fast track review, modifications to supplemental review option, which we'll talk about a little bit more. And so as a result, we're seeing an increasing number of states, Minnesota, New York, the Carolinas, Michigan, New Mexico, among others, really use the SGIP, adapt it to their jurisdictions to help bring order and greater organization to the interconnection review process. All right, let's talk a little bit about the structure and the key characteristics of technical review. And this is really taken from the SGIP, which, as I mentioned, is a primary vehicle for a lot of states and utilities are structuring their processes off of. And so you can see that, really that at a high level, technical review in this structure really involves screening criteria, initial and supplemental levels of review, and if needed, a detailed level of review, which, each of these levels has an incremental level of complexity baked into it. And so, for instance, proposed small residential rooftop PV, for example, these types of installs tend to only require simple and well-defined screens to determine their approval for grid connection. And when we start thinking about larger, more complex PV applications that may fail maybe some of these initial screens, they can, more involved supplemental review screens can be applied here, or a detailed study can be done. And this level of review is really expected to help identify and propose measures in addition to costs for mitigating potential grid impacts, right? So most of today's interconnection review processes really follow the steps depicted in this figure. And so just a quick walk through it. Once you receive an application, it's really given a preliminary review for completeness, and particularly for smaller systems, we're talking 0 to maybe upwards of 50 kW in size. These can essentially be expedited and not require a significant level of review to reach interconnection approval and permission to operate. However, when we start moving downward, when we see larger projects, for example, or circumstances that of greater complexity, given grid topologies and other issues, that might require what we call the beginnings of the fast track review process and the application of initial review screens. You can see some of those issues in the yellow box that are explored on a pass-fail basis, and the idea here is, again, trying to avoid a full-blown technical study, which requires greater resources, cost, and time to complete in order to be able to keep up with volumes and, again, also ensure, of course, grid safety and reliability. In the situation in which a application fails one of the typically 10 fast-track initial review screens, that would then trigger supplemental review, which adds an additional layer of review and oversight. And failing that, you would slide into a full-blown study process. So I want to provide just a quick understanding of maybe what this looks like with a representative snapshot of kind of the makeup of applications that go through the review process, akin to the SGIPs that I just showcased here. And this is taken from Duke Energy in the Carolinas, circa 2015 to 2019. And what we're seeing here is that the vast majority, 93% of the 21,000 applications that were received by the utility in the 2015-2019 timeframe, these applications were small in size, right? These were less than 20 kW, likely mostly behind the meter rooftop PV installations. And these applications were expedited. They didn't go through a screening process, and they were interconnected fairly quickly. But it's important to note here that when you think about these applications on a megawatt capacity basis, they really represented just 5% of total interconnected capacity. So there's a real difference between the total number of systems and applications that are reviewed in this manner and their aggregate impact from a capacity standpoint. Meanwhile, a lower percentage of applications, about 3.5%, but a higher percentage of megawatts that this tranche represents, they went through the fast track initial screens. And a small percentage of these fast tracked applications were interconnected. And then many of the applications were sent on to further review and supplemental review, which were eventually either approved or shipped off to system impact study, which is full-blown technical review. The remaining 3.5 applications of these that were received by the utility totaled about 3.5% of applications in number, but they represented 87% of the megawatts that were megawatt capacity that were being reviewed for interconnection. So you can really see that the bigger stuff, which can potentially create a significant grid impact, that really resides here in this more involved study, requiring modeling data and additional time and cost. Let me press pause here and hand the microphone to Tom Key, who will talk through for us a bit more about the current practices for DER interconnection.
Yeah, thanks, Nadav. I think that was a great overview of this whole process. It'd be a good time maybe to pause and see if there's any questions. And there's none in chat, but yeah, I encourage you all again to use the chat. And I will turn on my camera because I have a brand new camera today and a new mic. So let me do also a sound check. Is it About right?
Hearing you loud and clear.
Okay.
Sounds great, Tom.
Yeah. Okay. Questions? I'll mention the process that we showed for Duke in Carolinas. Same, very similar results when we did a study like that in New York. I think it was 95% in New York, but they allow a larger single phase systems to expedite. And that varies. I think the 20 to 50 kilowatts is sort of the range. Maybe some state jurisdictions are a little less than that. But now go ahead to the let's.
Can I ask on this one?
Oh
On
yeah,
the Duke,
thank you. Yes.
on the Duke data, well, I don't see anything failing. So
There's withdrawals. You mean failing in the fact that the upgrades were too expensive?
well, yeah, that they ultimately didn't get built. So I guess you're saying with enough upgrades, anything can be built.
Well, and that's the general rule, and of course, the idea that you might give up, through the process. I was surprised the Duke withdrawals were smaller. We had a much larger number of withdrawals in New York, as I recall, but the number of installs in North Carolina and South Carolina has really, I guess, been a success story, you could say. I think maybe North Carolina is second to California for the number of distribution connected. It's gotten to where some feeders are full, and it's switching a bit over to larger systems and transmission connected. But yeah, it's all the process. We're learning from the process, and it's been a great evolution, I think, for both customers and utilities. There's quite a bit of detail, and that's what I was going to go into. If go on to the next slide, Nadav, the number of things that you need to look at as the penetration grows and the size of the systems increases, and then of course there's complexity, let's say, of adding energy storage and systems that are just more complex. So we try to categorize it here just into 4 areas, right? I mean, location matters probably the most, right? Whether it's close to the substation or further away. And there's some criteria on that even in the SGIP. And then, usually the first thing that needs to be looked at is voltage impact and thermal, which we also call capacity here. That, does the system have the capacity to handle it? And then when the increase in fault current gets to a certain level, then you going back and checking the protection coordination is becoming a more important issue as the aggregate number of systems or the overall fault contribution increases. So yeah, that's just a sense of the type of things we look at. Go to the next slide, Nadav, and thank you. I took some time in working with some different jurisdictions to put it all in a list, and there's actually 2 slides to this. Sorry for the amount of detail, but you can see what you can do. Thanks, Nadav. You can go back again, and you can identify sort of why are we doing this, this screen or this technical review, what are we concerned about? So we categorized them all. We identified the issue, and then we, in this case, we're pretty much just following, as Nadav referred to, the FERC SGIP, which has been the most commonly used screening method, and they end up with like 4-digit descriptions of around 13 screens. And so these slides depict those screens. We noted, and it's important for the utility when they do their technical review, is it an individual a plant screen, or is it an aggregate? And about half the screens are aggregate screens where you have to keep track of what's been connected, and you know, as well as the characteristics of the substation and the feeder. We've also identified some limits, and then where we get some help from standards like 1547, we've identified in there. So yeah, it can all be laid out in great detail, and I think we're getting a better and better understanding of how to use these screens and make it not only more effective, maybe less conservative, because we understand what needs to be looked at, and easier process. So this next slide just continues, same idea, aggregate or individual, you know, the FERC numbers, all the way into the 3.4 are the so-called supplemental screens in the FERC SGIP. And these also track, I didn't try to do it to make even more of an eye chart, but I could list a column here that shows Illinois, Michigan, and, you know, in particular California, and how they kind of map out with the same issues. And in fact, Nadav indicated, you know, we think of 1547 as primarily affecting North America, but these same issues we see in very similar standards in Asia, in Australia, in Europe. So it's pretty common. It breaks down to what needs to be looked at as we install more and more distributed generation. Still looking for questions on the chat. Go ahead, Nadav. We can continue, I think, if there's no questions.
Tom, we have a gentleman with his hand up. Go ahead.
Oh,
Mr.
yeah.
Norton.
Let's watch for that. Noli?
Yeah, could you say more about the backfeed criteria? I feel like I've heard different things from utilities at different times about that.
Now, the pink one at the bottom, right? Yeah, and there is not a specific screen for that. You could obviously, you know, the backfeed starts at the plant, but it's usually getting utilities' attention if it gets up to the head of the feeder, like the substation. So you basically have, you know, more generation on the feeder than you have load, and on through the feeder, there's commonly you have regulators, right, depending on the length of feeder and so forth, and they modern regulators can handle backfeed. Some of the older ones have to be upgraded in order to handle the backfeed. And then, you know, as you go back with multiple feeders with backfeed, actually pushing up into the transmission, you know, the issues change. They get a little more difficult. Like, can the transmission actually handle backfeed? Maybe one of the first questions, but you've got questions about the substation's capability, the voltage regulator at the substation. So you know,
it's not necessarily a showstopper if the power is running backwards in the feeder. It just makes the study more difficult.
Oh my, yeah. I mean, it hasn't been a showstopper because we have a lot of it, right, going on. We have some feeders that are many hours a day are backfeeding, and, you know, you've seen the duck curve in California. There's a lot of backfeeding going on, but yeah, the specific issues need to be looked at in aggregate, right? It's one of the, yeah, and I don't know why I called it individual here, because it should have been aggregate. So you caught an error, one error in my charts. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and, you know, voltage I mentioned earlier is sort of the first thing that gets affected by distributed generation, just because you're out on a feeder and there's impedance between, you know, the normal source and the generation. So we took a hard look at voltage, just trying to see what kind of preliminary and initial screens we could further develop, and you see some of the criterias here, as well as when you fail initial screening, the idea and that chart that Nadav showed is that you go to a supplemental review, and then what additional things do you need to look at it? You can see in here, I did capture some, California rules and IEEE other IEEE standards as well, and compared what 4 different, if you count for 4 different jurisdictions, as well as where you get some help from the IEEE standard. One of the things that the IEEE standard really did a lot to get us ready for higher penetrations, and as well as the capability of inverters. And one of the things that you can see in this chart, we were able to nail down some power quality limits in the 1547 that and take some of the worry out of that when you get out to a site installation. Okay, I see another note. I think it's answering the same question. It had to do the reverse power in something like a low voltage network, could be a spot network, or in a city network. That's a particular issue because the network protectors are often opening immediately if they have backfeed, so which could cascade into a outage for the customer. So we're working on that actually on several projects to look for ways to modify the network protectors to allow backfeed. So everything is leaning toward more backfeed because it's a trend, right? Go ahead, Nadav. I think we can move on. I think this is a good summary of motivations to improve the process. The utilities have a lot of motivations, and obviously developers and customers do too. But you can see just trying to apply what's in the standards, especially with inverter connections, and then with the increasing numbers, not having a extra staff to look at these systems, the idea that there's a kind of a hosting capacity limit and maybe ways to use that in both planning and interconnection decisions. As I mentioned, protection issues, or the complexity that having energy storage brings, where it could be generating, it could be storing, and it's the rapidity that it can do that is not really limited unless it's built into the system to limit charging and discharging. So and overall, I think this experience of putting DER out on the feeder has caused us to realize we really need to update the data that describes our feeders, right, and our loads. And now with DER in that same database and protection settings and everything else, I think we show that as far as what we'll cover today are 2 things. We go on to the next slide. I think we highlight. I'll cover a bit on just a couple of specifics in the 1547 that we're, it's both supporting the grid, but it's something that we also try to use for compliance when doing interconnection reviews. And I think Nadav's going to cover a bit more on batteries, which is some recent work. And in fact, Nadav, did we put the batteries link into the chat?
It's not in there, but it is on one of the slides, and we can certainly do that.
Okay, we'll get that. And I see a long answer. Is that an answer or a question, Shay?
Yep, that was an answer. Just explaining transformer backfeeding comments. So,
thank you. Yeah, so let's talk about 1547. It's really been a significant effort of the standards making process in IEEE. I think we started with the idea about the same time California initiated some of the screening. We're seeing the DER was becoming a significant thing, especially with inverters and solar. So in 1999, we got started to create a standard. It came out in 2003. It was pretty conservative, as you might expect, with very little experience, especially with high penetration levels. So the rules in that early standard was not to actively do anything with the grid voltage, and basically to just trip offline if anything's, becomes somewhat abnormal. In 2014, we changed those to a MAY, that in fact, we're starting to recognize that the DER could actually contribute and support the grid. So may actively regulate, may ride through abnormal, may provide some frequency response. And that led to the major update to the 2003 standard. And there was enough understanding at that time to put the shall be capable, right, of regulating, shall ride through, and shall be capable of responding if the frequency is abnormal. In 20, even now we're updating again the 1547 2018. I won't give you a date, but it'll, in a few years there'll be another update. But one that turned out to be a bit urgent and came out as a 1547A had to do with areas with very high penetration. And in those areas, we actually have 3 different ride-through levels, and level 3 is now being used in areas like, well, certainly Hawaii, California, but other in the Northeast. And there was a couple of issues in the standard that, related to the Category 3 ride-through that got updated. I think if there's no questions verbally or in chat. Inverters enabled a lot of this so-called smart inverters and this whole evolution, from 2003 to now. And I think we're showing a picture of the main standards here, but yeah, all the options and selectivity and, settings and different ways that you could support reactive power, different levels of ride through. And I think it's all, just beginning to happen. It'll vary from one jurisdiction to another of whether or not and which of these settings actually get used. But the trend is to take full advantage of the speed and of the power electronics and the accuracy that we can get with a lot of resources that are whether they're batteries or fuel cells or solar, that are going to use a power electronic device, an inverter, to connect. I think no questions on that. I think this just kind of go back and generalize a little bit the sort of the role. You could break it down, right? The role of this the standard. It clearly defines performance. I think there's 60 very specific performance requirements for the distributed energy resource, and in fact, the standard basically, those requirements, lead to the certification of the DER. At the same time, that definition of what the DERs are doing then feeds into sort of the technical review for interconnection that's required. How to use the flexibility that are in the inverters, and managing, just larger numbers of applications and higher penetrations. And it's a bit of a settlement, I think, right? On, okay, we're clear on the requirements. We're learning how to do the technical, faster and better. And so there's clearly value to stakeholders all the way around. Okay, Nadav, are we switching now and you're going to pick up if there's no questions for me?
I think I'm up. Let me give it a moment, though. Anyone on the phone or in chat have a comment?
If you want to, I can put this in chat. If you want to join and help out on the standards development, there's a lot of opportunity for that. So we can or I'll tell you what, do we have, I'll put my email and Nadav's email into the chat. So if you have any questions, you can also follow up that way. Okay, Nadav, to you.
Thanks, Tom. That's helpful. I just want to make sure, sound check. Are you guys hearing an echo or am I coming across clear?
Sounds
About
good.
5.
Okay, thank you. This is part of the glitchiness that is messing with my juju here. I want to continue the discussion by saying a few words about energy storage. Again, what I alluded to earlier in our presentation, and really storage being another key reason for considering changes to existing technical review, including the screens, right? And that's really a reflection, as I mentioned, of the technology's flexible operation. You know, I think as we all recognize, storage really is unique compared to other DERs, right? It can serve as both generation and load, right? As a source and a sink. So it really has this versatility in terms of its ability to absorb excess generation from the grid or export to it during, let's say, peak times. And that's a lot different compared to, let's call it standalone solar, which is less flexible and can only serve as generation, right? Not as load. It can only generate electricity when certain external stimuli occur, like the sun shining. Storage can control active and reactive power. It can modulate its absorption or the injection of reactive power in relation to grid voltage. And it can also reduce active power to decrease voltage. So, in shorthand, these features can really help address grid instabilities and fluctuations in power quality. It offers multiple operating profiles and can be used by multiple customers or grid purposes. So these various use cases, again, speak to the versatility of storage either being grid tied or islanded and being used for a variety of purposes beneficial to the grid and to end use customers. And then finally, it can be designed to a schedule. That's a big deal, right? The amount and timing of power exports or imports can be controlled really to help benefit the grid. So in that pink box here, what we're really talking about when we think about storage's flexibility is we're talking about the safe and reliable capability to control when and how much storage imports and exports electricity, and whether those imports and exports are actually happening from the grid to the grid in coordination with maybe a co-located solar system or another generation and load source. And this, with that in mind, we recognize 4 key interconnection barriers that exist to really fully realizing that energy storage flexibility. And I want to plug the batteries project, which was a DOE award that was led by the Interstate Renewable Energy Council, IREC, and contributed to by EPRI for a number of insights around how we might be able to overcome certain barriers that have been identified to storage interconnection. And some of this comes out of that material, right? We see that, for example, interconnection procedures today, they don't really exist to define storage, or if they do, they may not really lay enough of a foundation for describing how energy storage's unique operating characteristics can be leveraged, right? Procedures may define storage as maybe a facility that's eligible for interconnection, but it might not include the necessary terms and the definitions for how that interconnection and the operation of that asset may occur. Procedures don't really recognize the way storage systems can be operated, right? The processes that are now being used, they don't really enable scheduling capabilities of the storage asset, right? So an interconnection process may not have the input parameters, let's say, to recognize the way a system can be operated, maybe, for example, scheduled in a way that grid impacts can be avoided during peak times. And I think these last 2 points are really interrelated and can be combined to a certain extent. There's really this lack of standardized controls that are embraced and that can enable limited and non-export systems. And that's leading also to a trust issue among utilities, right? That energy storage assets are really going to do what they say they're going to do as part of an interconnection agreement. All these things are surmountable, but currently need to be baked into technical review. So I'm looking at time here, and I want to move on to some improvement opportunities. Tom and I are going to tag team on this. I'll start with some initial thoughts, and we can deep dive into any one of these that you guys on the phone would like us to. But you know, we're going to go through a few of these and see what resonates with you. There's a range of ideas that encompass enhancements to technical review of interconnection during the interconnection process. But I just want to also say that they extend beyond screens. We're going to focus a little bit more on screens, but these are a little bit broader. So first off, we recommend evolving initial reviews, and that can really be done in part through automation. That was actually partially discussed by Jeff and the Precise tool. First level technical screening, it can be integrated into an automated application management process. That's being proven out today through a variety of portals, homegrown by utilities, or through third-party packaged products. And that can really enable access to data that's really needed to complete different screens, particularly those on the first level plane. And we also recognize that updated screens, as well as firmed up pass-fail criteria for those screens, those can help also further enable automation. Separately, we also think that screening processes, if they can be made robust and comprehensive, they can also help to streamline more in-depth analysis that may be needed, right, as part of a full technical study, right, that requires power flow analysis, for example, to understand system impacts. And the idea here is that conducting more limited full study analysis that's focused on a specific area of an application that was found to be deficient as part of the screening process, doing that really can save time and it can save money. Typically SIS, those screens, or excuse me, those reviews can take up to 60 days or longer. So being able to shrink that down can be beneficial for all involved. A second area here is hosting capacity analysis. We'll provide a little bit more thoughts on this in just a moment. And I think Shay might touch on some of the points here in his discussion. But really, we see hosting capacity analysis really being leveraged prior to screens or as a complement to screens to aid in the review process. And again, just to define some terms, hosting capacity analysis, for those of you who might not know, it's really the process of modeling the grid to determine those conditions that impact the ability to host additional DERs at specific grid locations without costly upgrades, without needing to make those kinds of investments. And hosting capacity results can really potentially help answer certain interconnection screens and also be used to verify that the screening process as a whole correctly captures DER-related impacts. It's meant to be complementary. Hosting capacity analysis can also be implemented into publicly available tools, such as hosting capacity maps that are beginning to emerge in different jurisdictions. And that's really intended to help customers and developers identify and self-select areas on a utility system that are unconstrained, and that can allow for easier interconnection. I don't want to go further there because I believe that's something that Shay might be going into greater detail on. Don't want to take any fire there. Staff learning I won't get into, but the basic idea here is through training aids, checklists, engineering guides, all of these offer ways to standardize approaches and harness efficiencies for completing interconnection review. Additional improvement opportunities include feeder modeling, which we've talked a little bit about, and we see the need for enhanced modeling capability, as do utilities, as they continually talk about the notion of available data, of data cleansing, of data integrity as being really a major challenge that can affect technical review. And as we see greater DER being added to the existing power system, that's really pushing the need for better load models and more frequent updates to geographic information systems, GIS, right, to capture feeder changes that can be incorporated into interconnection analysis of new DER, proposed new DER. The notion of smart inverters and settings in circuit models for future studies, that's what we think it should be integrated and is being integrated to properly gauge grid impacts. The last two items here, I'll briefly touch on mitigations and upgrades. This is really a little bit more focused on costs and efficiencies, perhaps thinking about moving to cluster studies or group studies in which several applications are looked at simultaneously to look at grid impacts, and should mitigations be needed in a particular area of proposed interconnect, those associated costs can be spread across the group being studied rather than put on the shoulders of an individual project, which may make those projects uneconomic. Considering changes to regulator and smart inverter settings, again, using these emerging commercial pieces of equipment to their utmost. How do we do that in a successful and reasoned manner? Okay, this is where I think we want to take a little bit of time talking a little bit more about fast track reviews and opportunities for improvement, particularly those derived from the FERC SGIP. And given trends in DER deployment, several FERC screens need to evolve in our view. For example, a screen we feel should be modified to consider DER export limiting functionality and account for the increasing number of DER systems, typically with batteries, right, that are certified to limit export. And Tom's going to talk a little bit about more about that in succeeding slides. Another SGIP screen addresses grounding compatibility. And in SGIP and most jurisdictions today, this screen really doesn't consider differences in grounding that are needed between rotating machines and inverter-based DER technologies. This can cause projects maybe to fail the existing screen or to be subject to unnecessary upgrades. Power quality, there's an update there that we see as being useful in terms of addressing voltage and power quality. And again, I think this is another area that Tom will discuss. And then really jumping down in the interest of time to supplemental reviews, because the SGIP supplemental review criteria is for one less definitive than it is for the initial screens, we would advocate, and we see a trend emerging, providing more specific pass-fail criteria with options in the supplemental screens. We also think more time might be given to complete these supplemental reviews so that we can avoid penalties and ensure thorough review. Tom, let me pass it back to you for a few more perspectives based upon improvements that I just mentioned.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of these might have focused on the batteries. This idea, the concept of limited export actually was covered in 1547, but I think it wasn't, it hadn't really played out, but there definitely need to improve our methods for fast track with energy storage and the export, capacity being sort of certified and worked out, especially in the fast, to enable the fast track eligibility process. Another thing, it's not exactly on this slide, but it occurred to me, we were talking about North Carolina and how few systems were withdrawn or how many got connected, which is a very large number. That gets more complicated with the higher and higher penetration in the grid. And so there is, I think we haven't really resolved how do we deal with a lot of small systems that we could easily fast track, early on, And now the feeder, is so populated that it brings new issues that don't get covered in the fast track screening. So I think that's going to be a major area as far as being able to even, well, I say connect quickly, but even to study the aggregate, it has difficulty, and we don't really have a lot of tools that are designed for high penetrations of DER. I think, Nadav, unless you had something else on here, I guess that we mentioned the spot network. I think we talked about that earlier, the network protectors. Well, in the slide you just jumped past, of course, brings up that penetration point that I was getting at. I think in the early screens, the most famous screen was the so-called 15% rule, which was if it's more than 15% if the generation is more than 15% of peak load, we need to look at it pretty carefully. And with experience, that's evolved. I think maybe some states have already gone to 100% of min load pretty early in the screening process. The most common is if you fail the initial screens, then the very first supplemental screen is 100% of min load or 90% of min load. It varies in different jurisdictions. So we're learning more on how to handle high aggregates in the system, and that'll be an opportunity for improvement in the future. I think the next slide, Nadav, covers, if you'll flip forward. Yeah, go back one. Yeah, yes. Okay, right. Okay, so this is more on penetration screens. Sorry, I forgot about. Any point here you want to make?
I think this just provides additional background on the screens themselves, and the notion of why moving to a different metric, or excuse me, yes, a different metric known as export capacity from nameplate rating is appropriate.
Yeah, and I don't think we try to cover it so much in this presentation today, but I saw it in the precise model. The trend, I won't call it a trend, the reality with solar is curtailment, right? Curtailment was a way to get on the grid. In other words, if you're allowed to curtail a few hours, over a period of time, it's probably a lot easier to get connected. And that's what some of the schedules that are being processed in California, where the utility provides a schedule and it effectively increases their hosting capacity if people follow the schedule. And that brings in this concept of, export limiting, but maybe on a time basis. And Shay, I don't know, you may be going to talk about that as well, but it's a really key concept. And then another concept that's happening as this sort of the price of solar goes down, the value of electricity goes up, is that it might make sense to just build a larger system and expect to have some amount of curtailment, but the economics of the scale of the larger system make it work out for the developer. So, and that's a trend we call also flexible interconnection, which we weren't going to try to cover today. Okay, it says, how we doing on time? Mike asked that. Well, we can skip, I think, the additional inadvertent export screen. And Nadav, how are we doing on time?
Yeah, I think we're right up against the top. We just have maybe one or two more slides here, if that's kosher, Mike. I want to. All right, with my lance. I want to just really end on hosting capacity analysis, which I briefly touched on as part of kind of the quick overview of some improvement opportunities. And I think it's important, really, again, to provide a little bit more detail on how hosting capacity analysis can interplay with screens and further the technical review process. Many of the SGIP's fast track screens, they aim to determine whether an adverse impact is likely to occur, right, due to identified conditions that are unfavorable, right, for a particular DER's interconnection, right, the application. And hosting capacity analysis, it approximates how much of a resource can be accommodated by the distribution system, again, without needed upgrades. And then when we think about full studies, kind of to bring this into broad relief, they directly calculate if a proposed DER in combination with existing and queued DER will cause adverse impacts to the distribution system. So interconnection screens leverage less detailed information and technical results than detailed impact studies, which allows them to be efficiently applied, right, to a large volume of DER applications, particularly smaller applications. Meanwhile, hosting capacity uses more detailed feeder models and data than fast track screens, and that really enables it to provide more accurate results. And unlike detailed impact studies, hosting capacity really can quickly analyze DER impacts across entire feeders and planning areas, which really aligns it with the intent of fast track screens. So, in this way, what I'm trying to describe here is how hosting capacity analysis can really serve as a bridge between the speed of fast track screens and really the accuracy of detailed interconnection impact studies. And so if you apply it thoughtfully, we think that hosting capacity results can really potentially help answer certain questions being posed by the interconnection screens themselves. So again, like the screens, hosting capacity can help address specific issues around things like voltage regulation, thermal limits, and protection coordination. And where this has basically led to is California, right? The largest market historically and currently of DER, and how recent changes in Rule 21 there is really directing utilities, the three largest IOUs there, to use hosting capacity results. They call it integration capacity analysis, or ICA, in lieu of certain screens or in combination with certain screens to help move things ahead. And so that looks like, a possibility when we think about the structure of technical review, possibility of incorporating hosting capacity analysis, particularly within the supplemental review box, to aid in those reviews and to help to streamline, again, the process for those reviews. Okay, mindful of time, quickly run through some of our summary conclusions. Threw a lot at you today and hope that you were able to retain a lot of it. But we really see changes happening, and that's occurring through advances in technology, grid support, mandates and standards, increasing penetration levels, and what that means, as Tom suggested, in terms of reviews. That's really motivating factors. We also see as a response to these changes, the opportunities for automation, right? Especially applied to first level initial technical screening, right? And we see possibilities for evolving the screens themselves to cover new things like export limiting, to modify others like grounding capability and power quality issues, and to potentially incorporate things like hosting capacity analysis, again, leveraging it to play a bit of a larger role in interconnection beyond what it is currently doing from a planning perspective.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. Again, so great to be here with you all. Again, my name is Shay Banton. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm a regulatory program engineer and energy justice advocate at Interstate Renewable Energy Council, where I work part-time. I'm currently actually a full-time student doing energy policy, but I still have a knack and love for interconnection, and so I find myself just drawn to the pressing challenges that we all face as stakeholders involved in these processes. So today I'm going to be taking a step back and looking at the start of the interconnection process, kind of before the process begins, which is geared towards prospecting and how you can build out tools and ensure that developers and other community members have the right information in order to make decisions on where to apply and how that kind of impacts and intersects with all the other aspects of the process. So with that, just a brief overview. Again, I'm with the Interstate Renewable Energy Council. We are a nonprofit that works and probably has worked with a lot of you all in different regulatory proceedings, and we advocate for different solar development groups and really are now focusing a lot more on equitable and energy justice initiatives, which is what I'm kind of working on with IREC. So today I'm not really going to provide a traditional agenda. I just want to kind of propose some questions to you all to really be thinking about as we move throughout the agenda today. The first is what is grid transparency and why is it really important to the entirety of the interconnection process. Two is how, and that is how are prospecting tools used in interconnection. Then we'll move into looking at the most ideal and best practices and why do they work in certain territories. And then also I want you to kind of ask yourself as reviewing these materials, as well as the previous materials of my great co-presenters, what is next for prospecting and grid transparency. So starting off, quick to the point is what is grid transparency, and it's really ultimately just providing customers and the public information about the grid in the context of interconnection. It's really in order to help different stakeholders actually site a project in a location that's the most optimal, and I'll kind of walk through a little bit more about that, what that kind of means and how that also impacts other components of the process. So who is actually the stakeholders? Who are these groups of stakeholders that use this data? And there's actually quite a few more than you might think. I know we always talk about developers, but in actuality, there are several different stakeholders involved. Yourselves, regulators, and local government officials. There's a lot of use cases that we'll walk through for why these tools may be useful for yourselves, and also you're setting your policy objectives. DER customers and developers, obviously the primary target typically, but I think we just kind of lose sight of all the other benefits that other people experience. Utilities themselves, Nadav touched on this with host capacity analysis and its use cases for internal utility review. I'll expand on that a little bit more in my discussions. There's also a lot of groups, a lot of entrepreneurs who are really trying to utilize this data to help other customers and other use cases be used. Also, there's a lot of people in the research field who try to investigate these issues, looking at various equity aspects of grid deployment and adoption, which this grid transparency really inspires. And finally, stakeholders and NGOs, kind of like IREC. So just to review, I know we all are very familiar with this process, but the interconnection process is obviously a pretty in-depth one, but this is a simplified version of it, which simplifies it into 6 main steps: prospecting, application, evaluation, agreements, construction, and commissioning. I won't go into all these in depth, but I know we're all very familiar with it. But we'll start with how this kind of translates in framing this around what prospecting in particular and the grid transparency that is provided through various prospecting tools enables in the course of the entire interconnection process. So first and foremost, you have, if you kind of summarize those final 5 steps in your interconnection process, you recognize that there's just a lot of time, money, and resources that go into those steps in the process, from developers submitting, application fees and paying money for projects and to be studied, and the timelines along with that, utilities and the various resources that they have to dedicate towards evaluating those projects and managing the entire queue, and all the other stakeholders that are involved. So there's a lot of time and money and resources throughout the interconnection interconnection process. And so when we dive out or take a step back and think about prospecting in particular, we're thinking about how prospecting impacts or how can it change the dynamics and the amount of time and money and resources, and hopefully optimize the amount of projects, optimize those time, money, and resources to projects that are most viable for interconnection. So without prospecting, as shown here in gray, you kind of have like all the developers, all the communities that want to engage in interconnection really have a pretty indeterminate level of risk associated with the projects that they're applying with. So without that, they just don't know. They're just submitting projects to places where they think, or to sites and land that they've worked with landowners to negotiate with, and that's kind of it. And so there's not really a process in place, or there's not really any methods for improving the resource allocation towards interconnection resources in the most viable projects. So, but if we look into implementing prospecting, it does change a little bit of a landscape here. It moves kind of some of the processing for infeasible projects and what they can kind of do to revise. But ultimately, what we're looking at is that when you implement good and well validated prospecting tools that are well integrated throughout the entire process, you actually increase overall the percentage of all projects that are actually lower risk. So as you can see by these green lines, you have typically just a lot more projects that are going to be sited in areas that have been self-selected and self-filtered due to the available data that is provided to those who are siting those projects. And ultimately, what the goal of that is that you hope to actually increase, in the end of the day, the ratio of feasible to infeasible projects, also known by a lot of people as retention rate. How many projects start the process, the interconnection process, and actually make it through to interconnection. You're trying to reduce the number of infeasible projects. So again, you're trying to allow these developers and these groups to really efficiently site their projects, which then ultimately allows utilities and developers to allocate majority of their resources to low and moderate risk projects versus a very highly uncertain application process. So with that, we'll talk about now into the meat and potatoes, the prospecting tools that are the main enablers of grid transparency and of increasing efficiency throughout the process. So there are, 5 primary types of prospecting tools, and we'll walk through them each individually. But just to highlight those, we have pre-application reports, a very common and pretty like a pretty mature version of prospecting tools. Distribution system data portals is number 2, a little bit more novel, but also provides a lot more details and has a lot more use cases, and also expands the group of stakeholders that can utilize data. We have something that's kind of related, public queue reporting. Nadav and Tom and Jeff all mentioned this briefly and the importance of that, so we'll walk through that as well. We have then basic distribution system maps, which don't typically contain any robust analysis, but are just visibility into grid infrastructure and how that may impact different stakeholders and their siting practices. And finally, we have host capacity analysis, big topic, and we'll talk a lot about that as well and expand on a lot of the discussions that have already been had today. So moving into pre-application reports, in overview, pre-application reports are a type of grid transparency and prospecting tool that requires a stakeholder and interconnection customer to request data about a specific point of interconnection. There's typically a cost associated with it, and these reports sometimes are automatically generated, but often not, and require an actual individual at the utility to investigate and pull data from different resources internal to the utility to provide information about the potential point of interconnection to the particular developer. So there's usually a little bit of lag time and a processing time for utilities to deliver that information in about 10 business days. Some of the data that is typically provided and at least requested by a lot of stakeholders who advocate for pre-application reports to support the different stakeholders and prospecting stakeholders in the process include things such as circuit distance between the site and the substation, or between the actual distance between the site itself and a 3-phase circuit. If you don't really recognize or notice some of these terms like 3-phase or voltage regulation, please don't worry, we won't dive too deeply into that. But other pieces of data that are involved that help developers make decisions are the number of certain pieces of equipment like protective and regulating devices on the circuit that may have to be upgraded or changed in order to accommodate a certain project, as well as one of the main limiting factors, which is the conductor rating. So the wires themselves, how big they are, and whether or not they can accommodate additional current flow. Those are kind of some of the initial analyses that a siting person, someone from a developer side or a community looking to interconnect would investigate and review in order to determine whether or not this is a primary siting location for their project. There's a lot more data that can be added here, so I did want to have this. I'm not going to dive into it deeply, but you will have these slides for review later, and you can take a look at some of these components. But this is just a kind of a summary or a big screenshot of a lot of the different additional data points that are sometimes or often included in pre-application reports. But again, I really want to get back into the goal of this presentation is hopefully to have you understand the questions that different types of prospecting tools help certain stakeholders understand and how they can navigate and use that data in the future. So since we recognize that our main demographics, our main key stakeholders are the developer community, utilities themselves who have to manage these reporting processes, and then regulators yourselves and government organizations who are either crafting policy or creating the rules of the road. And so here's some of these questions that pre-application reports in general do, and we'll kind of follow this framing throughout the entire presentation today. So for developers, it's straightforward. What is ultimately, I just am, as a developer, are trying to submit a project or looking into submitting an application, I want to know before if there's a large risk for potential grid upgrades before I submit my project into the queue. And that is informed by some of those questions about whether the circuit is nearby to my proposed site or how many projects are already interconnected or queued to the circuit or substation ahead of my project. Obviously, there's a lot more questions there that correspond to the range of data points that are available in pre-application reports. From the utility perspective, the shift kind of changes, right? You're really trying to optimize how you're dedicating and spending your own internal engineering resources, which we all know in today's kind of career climate, like it's very difficult to find engineers and to staff for interconnection related issues. So you really want to optimize your engineering resources to spend on evaluating projects that are actually feasible, that are actually going to move forward. So you're not wasting time always evaluating projects that are bad. So how can you, as a utility, relay certain piece of information to developers while minimizing the amount of engineering resources it takes to gather that data in order to then hopefully optimize engineering resources throughout the entire interconnection process. And finally, regulators. So that's, again, that same kind of idea, but really focusing on, and I would love to hear your own opinions here if this is kind of correct in how you view these, but we kind of think of it as how you would like to increase the project retention rates throughout the interconnection process. Essentially trying to just make that process as efficient as possible, and therefore leading to the highest deployment of whatever DER technology that your policy or directive or government directive is trying to accomplish. So that is pre-application reports, and I'll move on to distribution system data portals. This distribution system data portals, I'll show a little graphic in the future in an upcoming slide. But these are really just websites that contain usually a plethora of downloadable data sets and reports about the distribution grid conditions and maybe sometimes potential constraints that are already well known by the utility. Some of these data points include load profiles of particular circuits or segments of the system, asset information about different equipment. So that means maybe a transformer rating or a circuit conductor rating, or again, that number of regulators between a proposed site and another location, or things like that. So there's a lot of relevant data that can be provided in these portals. As an example, this is National Grid in Rhode Island, and this is what they have in their data portal. And so they have a lot of the peak load demand processes. They even include links to the utility's internal distribution planning study process, which is typically helpful for a lot of developers as well to understand a little bit more about the evaluation methodologies that are used in the evaluation of a future project that wants to be proposed. But let's talk a little bit more about what some of these data, in particular load data, is really helpful for. So here's an example of a load profile obtained from a particular utility. And so you can see here we have, its course of a year, and we have, or many years, sorry, we have the various peak and minimum load profiles throughout those years. And so what a developer can then leverage or use this data for is to better design their systems to alleviate or avoid any constraints that this load profile is kind of indicating via the various peaks and minimums throughout. This is especially important for energy storage. So I won't touch on it that much right now because we will get into that in a future slide. But just for reference, this is kind of what a peak load looks like, and we'll kind of talk about more in the future. So again, taking a step back and thinking about the sorts of questions that this particular prospecting tool can provide, distribution system data portals, from a developer, you're really, again, trying to look at all those, gather as much data as you can and see if there's any additional identifiable constraints that could potentially increase the cost of your project interconnecting to the grid. And that can be impacted, as we learned a little bit earlier with the host capacity conversation, load and all the other conditions of the circuit or equipment settings and types and sizes are all factored into or all considered as part of the interconnection evaluation process. And so by giving a little bit additional transparency into those load conditions, developers can then hopefully work back and try to identify what other challenges might be associated with interconnecting of a particular system at a particular location. Then there's also, again, that highlight of energy storage and being able to see and understand the load profile of the system. It adds a lot of flexibility in terms of being able to better design the operational profile of your particular energy storage system to avoid any potential constraints. We'll get into that a little bit later, though, as well. From a utility perspective, again, trying to optimize those engineering resources, but in this case, it's really trying to kind of create a feedback loop that allows the analysis conducted in previous projects, taking that data, anonymizing it essentially, and getting it back out to the public so that they can make better informed decisions and not end up repeating the same, not mistakes, but the same challenges that occurred at projects prior. So let's say, for instance, a project, actually I looked one up in a particular utility territory where a 5 megawatt project triggered a whopping $105 million upgrade. I don't have the data around that, but that was in an interconnection queue report or queue report that I found online. But that information being relayed back to the public to say, hey, this substation cannot be accommodated. You should not be connecting here, or this circuit is well past capacity, and we do not think that anyone should be connecting here. And that information can be relayed directly into data portals that many utilities utilize around the country. And that also, again, ultimately allows utilities to refocus their resources on projects that are more viable by allowing developers and stakeholders trying to apply to avoid certain areas of the grid. And finally, regulators. So this is, if you're trying to take a step back at the 10,000 foot view, you're really trying to understand a little bit more how widespread are major grid constraints, and would proactive planning efforts help to avoid any bottlenecks? So are there any consistencies across that maybe you work with utilities to dissect a little bit more, or have been described in these data portals? If these are major grid constraints, let's say this is an example from New York, 3v0 is a big one. It's a protection scheme required for pretty big penetration scenarios, and so it's a very costly one. And so regulators, with the help of utilities and developers, recognize that pretty consistent thread across the state, and therefore we're able to create mechanisms, in this particular case, cost allocation mechanisms, to alleviate and then also expedite interconnections by preemptively installing these upgrades. So that's kind of example, again, how these systems can, you're basically creating transparency, allowing all these feedback loops to help in future decision making across different stakeholder groups. I'm not sure if I hear audio. Was someone hoping to ask a question? No problem at all. So next we're going to the public queue reporting. So a Q report is just that. It's typically a spreadsheet, sometimes in a PDF, which is a little bit less useful, but a published spreadsheet that details the status of projects within the interconnection queue itself. So it can be published on a pretty regular, or should be published on a pretty regular frequency as we advocate for here at IREC, but it does have sometimes a lot of really, really amazing details, such as the time within each stage of a particular review process, or again, that additional data about the cost assigned for a particular project, which can then inform future developers who look at that particular substation or circuit and say, well, I'm not going to try. And the important thing here again is that it requires high frequency update schedules and a pretty robust validation process to be useful. As with anything, if you provide poor information, the decisions that people use making that data aren't going to make sense, aren't going to be rational, because they are based on poor data and then may not yield the efficiency and process benefits that you hoped that these tools would provide. To look in as an example, I know this is very illegible, I can't really read it, so I'll simplify it in just a sec, but this is just a picture of what one of these reports looks like in one territory. But looking at kind of simplifying this data into what it typically kind of reflects in some of these spreadsheets. So it has like a list of projects and their size. It contains some information about the circuit and substation that they're connecting to. If you recognize these substation names, I named them after pretty famous people, as you might know, pretty great scientist. And then it may also contain information about the date of submittal into various portions of the process. In the most robust queue reports, you do have the start and end dates across any components. So whether it's the application being submitted and then the application being reviewed and returned back to the developer, that data can be included in this report, and then it can include that across all those other segments, from the application to the evaluation to the commissioning to the construction. All of those can be included. And it also includes typically, what's the current step of the project, giving a developer a lot of information about, okay, well, there's 5 projects all in the queue on this particular substation, and the earliest one in that queue position is still only in the application review phase. So it's going to take a while to get to me if I do. So just that a little bit of a peek information that additional grid transparency provides. And finally, I want to get into some of the big ones that are really, really helpful. I should have mentioned this before, but I worked for a developer for a few years doing interconnection reviews internally and on interconnection regulation and policy. And so this is kind of the steps I would take when evaluating the feasibility of a particular project. And so in this case, I would look at this and say, well, we have this project D that's 3 megawatts, and they withdrew because they experienced an upgrade cost on this particular circuit of $4 million. Therefore, if I submit a project that's 3 megawatts or above on this particular circuit, there's potentially a pretty high likelihood that I might experience that same exact upgrade cost associated with it. So I'm not going to submit a project. It's just not worth our time and our money and our resources, which subsequently is also good for the utility. They don't have to study a project and go through all the rigmarole of trying to evaluate a project that clearly would likely not be feasible. So again, that it all is connected. By providing additional transparency, it does provide a lot of benefits to all stakeholders throughout the process. So taking a step back again, looking at our questions. So from the developer perspective, how many projects are queued before mine? And do they tell me anything about the cost that my project may incur? So that's the kind of general topic that we kind of discussed and I walked you through. The utilities themselves, it does allow them to kind of take themselves a higher level view and see what queue processing improvements and challenges they're currently seeing. So whether they see across maybe 5 megawatt projects that their processing time for impact studies has been pretty long, and then they can kind of take that information and say, oh wait, we probably need to improve X, Y, and Z in order to address that. We have to increase staffing for the impact study review process, or we have influxes at these times of day throughout the year. And so those are some of that information that can easily be gleaned from actually collecting and publishing such reporting data. And finally, as a from regulator point of view and government official point of view, I think some of the best use cases for public key reporting is it does allow you to do some really in-depth monitoring of whether or not the utilities are, working are fulfilling their timeline obligations, or if there just is in fact an actual rule revision that's needed to increase processing times or create changes. So let's say there's just a huge influx of projects on poorly or low capacity circuits. That would be very indicative if you see a lot of failure rates in a certain location that maybe we need to broadcast that information to our stakeholders, and then you can have a conversation with your utilities about what is the tool that's best to relay that information. It also allows you to do some pretty cool and advanced analytical discussions and questions, such as trying to determine what the average process duration is of a certain range of projects. And so if that process is a little bit too long for a small type of system and you really want your program to expedite residential solar systems, then you can start looking with your utilities and developers to figure out how we can make those modifications. But that information was completely invisible to you without a public key report. The same goes for discussing average cost across different megawatts or different size projects. And so that's really typically pretty helpful, especially when guiding maybe preemptive upgrades, as I mentioned before. And I think I heard some audio. Is there another question? And unfortunately, I cannot see the Teams chat for some reason. So if there are questions, please, Mike or anyone else, pause me and I can kind of answer those. Give it 2 seconds and see if anyone has anything. Perfect. So basic distribution system maps is number 4. And looking at that, we have that kind of this picture here on the right. It's copied in the background. And they are just simply a map of the distribution system assets and feeder lines throughout a system. So these often also include a pop-up box that displays grid data, which I'll show a reflection of in a second. But let's move forward. There's a lot of data that could be included and are requested from different development groups and advocacy groups. Again, I'm not going to stick to this. There's a lot of data here, but it's really kind of syncing up a lot of the data we saw before. I kind of put these in order too, these different prospecting tools from kind of the simplest and I guess most mature form of prospecting tool, the pre-application report, and how that data can kind of be translated and expanded upon in each of the following ones. So in this case, not only are we still getting some of that data that the pre-app gave us from the distance to the 3-phase circuit or to the substation or limiting conductor rating information, but it's expanding it by making it a GIS accessible map, which adds a visual component and allows for pretty easy digestion of the information. So taking a step out to our questions again, from a developer standpoint, it's giving a level of additional flexibility. I'll talk a little bit more about this in the host capacity section, which I think is really helpful, but it's similar to related to here. But it just gives you, without having to go through submitting a pre-application report and waiting 10 days, or submitting multiple, which floods, a particular, interconnection engineer at the utility with a bunch of reports that they have to fill out in a certain amount of time, and they're overburdened and overstressed. This allows a developer to really do that without need for back and forth intervention between those two parties. So they have a setting flexibility. They can look at different sections of the grid and then optimize their location based on very similar questions that we learned that developers typically ask themselves in their grid transparency and prospecting process. Utilities then can also again increase that feedback mechanism and inform in these distribution maps exactly where to avoid submitting projects. Maybe there's a pop-up window when you click on a particular segment that says this project already has 20 megawatts of queue projects. That could be simply a small deterrent, and only people who are willing to make that risk can go forward. Or there could be other information saying, hey, this particular circuit actually is no longer subject to the particular, maybe it became FERC jurisdictional because of another project. I know that happens kind of rarely, but if that happens, you can kind of inform that and say to your stakeholders, this one is no longer actually applicable for a NEM process or community solar program because it has shifted jurisdictions due to some other constraint or some other regulatory scenario. And finally, regulators, from a regulator standpoint, it's additional insight into to monitoring interconnection rules, and then actually understanding whether distribution planning needs need to be changed or need to be addressed. And so having that visualization, I have to agree, this probably isn't as useful as like a host capacity map, but again, having that visual does allow for some interesting analyses, which I know a lot of regulators are investigating various equity concerns and components. And so having GIS related data to overlay across other demographical data is likely going to be very helpful in ensuring a more just and equitable transition, as I'm sure we all are focused on doing together. And finally, we have the host capacity analysis. So in general, we already went through this a little bit with Nadav, but it's a really advanced grid transparency tool that provides some pretty detailed assessments using actual detailed modeling. And there's a variety of tools, EPRI Drive tool. There's the ICA maps in California. And then there's other, I guess, more research-centered host capacity tools like the DISCO tool from NREL. But this allows you to really relay, after performing that analysis on a grid-wide scale, to deliver that information, provide that transparency and visibility to all the stakeholders that want to participate in the interconnection process. I'll provide a link to this in the chat, but IREC has developed a lot of resources on this topic in particular, and I'll provide that as soon as I can get out of the presentation mode a little bit later. Here's an example of the ICA maps, Integrated Capacity Assessment maps in California. So again, it has these visuals associated with, provides information about where that substation is. Again, giving, if anyone developer decides to select a location or has a site owner interested over here, they can easily investigate further with those stakeholders or ask additional questions like we did in the pre-op report and the other prospecting tools about how far they are from the substation, which may inform them about the capacity. But on top of that, just the distance characteristic, we now have an actual informed and an analysis informed capacity value associated with that particular location. So if this is a very robust and trusted and validated analysis, then it has a lot of trust from the developer community and different community stakeholders. Now we have a very easy way for anyone to kind of come up here and select a potential location, see if there's additional capacity, and have at least a high amount of confidence in whatever the host capacity map is telling you. Whether it's red here saying that there's none and you probably shouldn't go there, or it's green over here which says there's a lot. There's 12 megawatts of capacity, and therefore that might be a good location for community solar. So to dive a little bit more into that siting flexibility, again, this is very similar to the distribution system maps in some scenarios, but a little bit of information to show you here is that when you have when you're looking at a larger map and clicking on different circuits and trying to identify where you can go, you can easily pull out segments of the information to determine whether or not a site is optimal for you. So for instance, here we're able to plug out or pull away from this particular map generated from Portland General Electric that there is currently 0 DG currently interconnected or in queue on the system, and that the feeder actually is DG ready. I'm not actually super familiar on what that term means. I'm assuming it means there's some bidirectional controls that have been installed. And this also says there's no generator limited. And then it also says that the substation transformer is also DG ready. Again, likely alluding to what we were talking about in the chat about the various constraints associated with higher penetrations of DG connecting and outputting and causing backfeeding or different challenges on the system. So this is saying to a developer, hey, this is actually a pretty good site up front. On the other hand, you can see another area which is showing that there's only 1 megawatt of DG connected, but there's also a good bit of DG in queue, and that the feeder and substation are not actually ready or available or ready to accept DG, which means, again, they may be lacking some of those pretty important upgrades, and therefore this might require be higher risk and also require a little bit more cost upfront in the interconnection process, or at least longer study times associated with determining what these feeder and substation level upgrades might be. So those are some of the information that a developer or other stakeholders may glean. Taking a step back into our questions for different stakeholders. Again, developers, I think we did a lot on, but really trying to understand whether or not a particular system in a particular location could require long studies or major upgrades. From a utility perspective, they can do a wider view of what kinds of grid constraints are limiting hosted capacity on a wider basis, so they can form greater analytics and determine maybe there's some distribution planning, proactivity planning for distribution planning that can be performed in order to avoid these grid constraints, avoid them from keeping to pop up. So you can kind of take a holistic view, see what's going on, and then make decisions in the future to alleviate those concerns. We also had a note here that utilities that Nab mentioned can also leverage host capacity analysis if it's robust enough and validated enough for their internal review. So they can perform their screens. They can also still assign an interconnection engineer to review the project, or they can have reduced those constraints and actually use the validated host capacity analysis internal to that review and say, actually, your project is well below the limits of the host capacity analysis. We made it. We trust the host capacity analysis that we conducted. Therefore, you can kind of, be expedited and move through the process more quickly. So those are some use cases that utilities may see value in. And finally, regulators, again, taking a 10,000-foot view, can really take a wider view of the relationship between host capacity of their system and their ability to actually achieve the various renewable energy adoption, electrification goals that they may have. So working with utilities, after utilities perform these larger analyses, they can really conduct all sorts of political or policy-related analyses to just determine what next steps need to be taken from a regulatory standpoint in order to enable or reduce barriers to interconnection across a variety of different policy objectives. And they can even do it from a regional standpoint or a zip code or a demographical standpoint. So again, they can integrate some of those equity considerations into their review as well. I want to highlight here, I'll add a link in the chat as well. This is our report on host capacity analysis and the key decisions it's geared towards and made for regulators and utilities. So please highly recommend taking a look if you're not familiar with host capacity analysis, but it does outline the various decisions from the granularity of the analysis, the model inputs, the actual evaluation methodologies that can be employed. It has a lot of great information, and so I'll share that in the chat as well. So that is the type of prospecting tools. So I know there's a lot. Real quick, I have another section, but I just want to get a quick time check since I cannot see the time on my screen right now. Mike, do you mind letting me know how much time I have left?
You're doing okay. Probably got about 10 more minutes.
Perfect. I heard 15, so I'll go 15. I'm just joking. I'll go 5 or 10. So thanks, Mike. So the next step is really diving into some of these tool considerations. So key aspects of these tools to consider when developing or requiring the development of such tools. So how can you engage with stakeholders? How can you work with them to ensure, and how can you ask the right questions to ensure that the prospecting tools are going to do their job at the end of the day? So here are some common ones, or I think the most common ones. So this is just a list of all the tools that we saw on the left here. And so then we can kind of talk a little bit more, or just to give a frame reference, the availability of these tools today is kind of listed here. I won't get into that too much, but some things to note: that there's a cost differential between different tools. This is the customer cost. So how does that impact various customers being able to enter into the process? Is it always optimal to reduce that price, or do you want to have a balance? That's a great question for regulators to ask and think about. Then the opposite side of that coin, though, is who's going to be impacted most by these decisions is going to be the utilities that actually develop and manage these tools. So utility efforts have to be an important consideration. How much time does it take to create these tools? How much time does it take to refresh these tools? And how do you then actually what is the development timeline and process for actually creating them in the first place. So there's a lot of questions there. The utility effort is very, very important, which is why utilities are obviously a key stakeholder group that needs to be involved in all these conversations, as well as customers. And finally is ease of access to customers. So I kind of answered this before, but how are customers using the data, and what is the data really informing them to do? Like, what is the result of them using that data, and is that result, there's that end decision in alignment with what the larger policy level goals are trying to do? So if it's trying to increase the penetration of small residential systems, then does the tool help you, gear or direct those projects and expedite the processing of them in the interconnection process, for instance. The big one too that Nadav and Tom already mentioned is that various tools enable different levels of energy storage development, and typically there's a high correlation between the more resolution and more granularity a prospecting tool provides, and the more useful it is towards energy storage. In this picture on the left, we have Xcel Energy's, which has a blurred distribution line system, which for a lot of developers is very difficult to determine, and one, to answer a lot of those questions about where to connect a system to an existing line itself, as well as more useful information about how does the operational profile of a particular area going to impact the size of my project, and can I then design my system to avoid that? Therefore, again, increasing the retention likability or retention rate of my particular projects I'm submitting. So giving that information, creating those feedback loops of transparency. And on the right, then we have a host capacity map that shows those precise values. I think this is from maybe New York. Oh no, this is DC. Hey, there's my house. I live in DC, so I'm very excited. I didn't even notice that when I made this slide together. But yeah, more precise locations that you can actually see the exact data. So very big benefit is enabling energy storage development. And as Nadav and Tom mentioned, we did go through this really robust, amazing process funded by the Department of Energy to develop the batteries toolkit, building a technically reliable interconnection evolution for storage. And so I'll provide a link there, but it's a great resource, highly recommend it. And it's been actually adopted and integrated into several different regulated initiatives. I think Oregon has taken a lot of recommendations. New Mexico recently took majority, I think, of those recommendations. And it's a really robust tool for actually navigating all the questions that need to be addressed for enabling any storage development from a prospecting perspective all the way through to an evaluation and agreements perspective. Second to last is important of data validation. So I mentioned this before for host capacity a bit, like that there has to be trust, there has to be validation process, or else you're going to kind of reduce the effectiveness of the tool that you work so hard to create. So I did work with NREL to create this report, another one funded by the Department of Energy, and does have a lot of great practices that can be instilled from hiring certain or creating different teams, and this is just a structure of those teams, to the validation process itself, how to look at models and how to validate those particular models. And so it's just a really robust analytical framework for determining host capacity data validation. But this also applies across any one of the prospecting tools I discussed today. So really think about this in terms of, do we have a validation process for pre-application reports? And I can tell from experience that in the past, I've had projects in the past where both pre-application reports and available queue reports have actually been incorrect and led to years and typically a couple, like sometimes $100,000 or more of wasted time and resources actually dedicating or customers and developers submitting projects to areas that aren't actually optimal for interconnection. So again, if you want these tools to be useful, they have to be validated, is the point there. And the final one I spent a little time on is something that's near and dear to my heart, is integrating equity and justice tenets into the decision-making process for tool validation. For those unfamiliar, these are the three major ones. There's also reparative, but recognitional justice is ensuring that the people, that all stakeholders, all relevant stakeholders are engaged with and know that they have access to discuss these issues with decision makers. Procedural is actually creating the robust processes to enable that engagement from those partners that have been contacted with and recognized. And then finally, distributional, which is focused on ensuring that both the cost and benefits are equitably equitably distributed across all stakeholders. So whether or not a tool benefits one group over another has to be considered in that decision-making process. So just to finalize some of these questions here, I'll just point out a couple of them. So have you as regulators engaged with all the relevant stakeholders? This is a big one. Are you meeting stakeholders where they're at? That is typically not done, to be honest, and a lot of stakeholders groups I work with feel very unheard. And so we need to make sure that we are not just creating a platform, a space for people to participate in, which again there's a lot of people who have a lot of barriers to participating, that we are actually going out and meeting them where they are. And obviously considering the historical impacts, as well as do people just feel enough trust in the system that they actually have a voice at the table. From a procedural standpoint, you're talking about accessibility. I've had conversations, and I think I want to bring this to light. I recognize that I do not have a transcript available, so this is not a fully accessible presentation. So I think we do have to, as a group and as regulators ourselves, when we're working with these, think about the accessibility of all of the information that we're putting out there. Is it in the right? Are there language barriers that certain communities may not be able to access in? Are there, again, visual impairments that might not be, or auditory impairments that might not be accounted for? And are there cultural barriers and socioeconomic barriers that aren't being thought of? So we definitely have to think about that. And then we also have to make sure we monitor that progress towards ensuring procedural justice. How are we ensuring that we're checking ourselves for the actions that we're doing? Are we checking in with those communities that are marginalized and typically overlooked to see if we are addressing their needs and concerns? And finally, we have distributional. So who are the primary beneficiaries of the tools that we create? How do we ensure that those tools and benefits that are associated with them are equally distributed? And what prospecting challenges can we help overcome? And are there cost and value created equally distributed by these tools and all the other components of the process? I do want to highlight here, though, before I hang up, this is my last slide, is that IREC is working with Volt Solar and a lot of other groups on creating or understanding and defining interconnection equity, and what under each component of the interconnection process, what are a lot of distributional challenges associated with the prospecting and other interconnection tools. So for instance, we learned in our meetings with different stakeholders that prospecting tools, as good as they've gotten in a lot of territories, are often entirely inaccessible to certain communities who, for the first time ever, can finally benefit from solar adoption and the increased resiliency that systems like energy storage and microgrids can provide. So we have to consider those perspectives and really think about how can we alleviate those prospecting challenges, in particular, lower the technological barriers, or create funding and grant opportunities for certain communities to actually hire the consultants and engineering expertise necessary to actively and effectively participate in this process. So with that, I believe that's all I have. So here's my contact information. I'm going to share all these links in the chat briefly, but it's so great to speak to you all, and I'll open up the floor to questions.
Let's see. So I2X, Interconnection Innovation Exchange, it's a program sponsored by EERE, by the Solar Office and the Wind Office. The website is there and will provide you a great deal more information about who's involved and our plans and roadmaps and all those sorts of things. So here are some resources that you can take advantage of almost immediately. We have interconnection office hours on Fridays. I think you can register for those, sign up for those through the website, and there is opportunity for direct consultation. There is no cost. That's sponsored through the program. There are solutions exchanges which are similar to this workshop, but intended to be more interactive, and more information there. And like I said, this information will be posted on the website, the workshop website. We are in the process right now, the technical assistance solicitation. We have targeted technical assistance with individuals or small groups of proposers. Principally, it's utilities, developers, utility commissions, or small cohorts of those, like maybe a utility, a muni, or and a commission, maybe with a developer to target a specific problem. Those have been submitted, and the I2X team, DOE, and the labs that are involved are reviewing those right now. If you're one of the folks on here, please don't ask me a question. I can't address that, but we are looking at those right now and going through an interview process and down selecting those for the technical assistance. What I want to talk about today is this new or additional opportunity with group technical assistance, and kind of kick that off with the shared independent system operator experience cohorts. So a little background, we worked with Colorado State University and Jeff Ackerman. Some of you may know, he was a commissioner in Colorado, PSC, to more than survey, but to target commissions throughout the country, kind of get a wide sense of what their issues were with interconnection. And he came back to us, CSU, and working with Jeff, recommended that we work with states that are working in cooperation with or under the jurisdiction, so to speak, of an independent system operator. And specifically, he talked about states that were in the ISO New England space and the Midwest ISO space, if you're familiar with those areas. So we're going to try to kick those off, and we would encourage states, utilities, developers that are in those spaces to give us your attention and give us your ideas on what those cohorts could work on together in cooperation with those system operators with respect to interconnection issues. And I have the list here of why we want to pull those groups together, because they have some shared experiences, they have some shared opportunities to work together, and there is some progressive nature, so to speak, from the bulk power system level to consider the implications of significant DER penetration. For those of you that are well studied, and this is not a test, but well studied on 1547, you understand that there is, as more and more DER are connected to the system, they can have without coordination, they can have an orchestral response, a collective response that can affect an event to the distribution, the bulk system. So we want to identify membership. So in addition to those two, we're open to the formation of additional cohorts being primarily groups of states, public service commissions, and those that those organizations that are stakeholders to those state commissions. So, but we're open to additional cohorts that we might start closer to this fall or into early winter, once we kind of get these two ISO cohorts off the ground. And what might those topics be? What might that collaborative look like? So we wanted to open it up for the group, make this available in the video and the transcript and so forth. If you're interested in helping us to form a third cohort or a fourth cohort, we have in addition to the website that Jeff talked about early, we have this email address that comes to our team, and we would welcome your ideas and your interest in participating in either of those two cohorts, the ISO New England or the MISO, or an additional cohort. Absolutely. I think it's on the last slide, Timothy. Let's see. So here's the website one more time. Jeff did a great job talking about this at the very beginning. And there's my information, and I can put that in the chat as well.
So Michael, I think you indicated the cohorts, they're really more peer-to-peer than technical assistance, or are they both?
They're both. They're intended to be both, because all the topics, I'm probably not going to say this politically correctly, but it seems like most of the states are different places, and different places on different topics. There's leadership or advancements in certain areas, we've talked about today, and maybe not as much in other states and other areas. It's kind of there's diversity there. And so the peer-to-peer part is to help, what does they say, high tide floats all ships, that kind of a perspective. But then for those things where there are opportunities for building capacity, the labs, NREL and the other folks that we are going to involve, we can provide technical assistance on those topics. We did, behind this cohort, or in addition to this cohort that presented these workshops, GMLC sponsored cohorts, not cohorts, but technical assistance on interconnection with round numbers around a half a dozen specific state commissions that we provided technical assistance on certain topics related to interconnection. NREL provided most of those, but Berkeley provided, LBNL provided technical assistance to some states in interconnection as well. So but this will be kind of a mixed delivery. Does that help?
Yeah, thanks. I'm just trying to put my thinking cap on and think about what a cohort could be.
Go back one slide. So if you're still on the call, and I think we'll probably send out an email, this website here, there's a banner kind of at the top and a topic called workshops. If you click on that, you can see information on the prior 2 workshops with the presentations, the agenda, and those sorts of things. And shortly, we'll have the presentations from this workshop posted. Probably take a little bit longer to get the video processed, and I think we'll probably post a transcript as well. So look for that. And I encourage you to register at this DER standards and kind of get on our mailing list. But there are a number of resources that are curated at that website, not just NREL reports, but other labs reports, DOE reports, IREC reports, EPRI. There's we tried to link to all the best resources and kind of summarize them so you could see what would be the most beneficial, the most helpful to where you are.